Hello biology nerds. Today we're going to talk about the skeletal system. That's going to include a discussion about osseous tissue and bones as organs, and we're also going to talk about joints and joint movements. Okay, the functions of the skeletal system are several. First of all, it helps to support the body. It also helps to protect internal organs. For example, your skull protects your brain. The vertebrae and the ribs help to protect the heart and lungs. It also helps us to achieve movement, right? Our bones are basically levers on which the muscles are acting, and it also helps for mineral storage. The bones are made primarily up of calcium phosphate, and as it turns out, we need calcium for other reasons besides bones. We need it for blood clotting, we need it for muscle contraction, and so anytime we don't have enough of that around, we go to our bones and pick some of that calcium out of the calcium bank. And finally, the bones are there for blood cell formation. We're going to find out that on the insides of bones, we have something called spongy bone, and this is where the red and white blood cells are made. Okay, there are four different elements of the skeletal system. Firstly, we have the bones. The bones here are organs composed of osseous tissue, as well as blood tissue, other connective tissues as well, nervous tissue, etc. Now, in addition to bones, we have ligaments. Ligaments are made up of fibrous connective tissue, which helps connect bone to bone. And then we have tendons. Tendons are also made up of dense, regular fibrous connective tissue, and they connect muscle to bone. And finally, we have a lot of cartilage associated with bone. We find cartilage on the articulating surfaces of bones, and this allows for smooth, friction-free movement. Okay, we're going to talk about the shapes of bones, and there are basically 5 different shapes. We have long bones that are long, short bones that are short, flat bones that are, no surprise, flat, and irregular bones that are, well, just irregular, and finally we have something called sesamoid bones. So let's take a look at some examples. So this is examples from the skeleton right here. Firstly, you can see this is the sternum. The sternum is a nice flat bone. Okay, what about the vertebrae? The vertebrae is irregularly shaped, so we call it an irregular bone. And then down here, we've got the patella. The patella is kind of sesame seed shaped, so we call it a sesamoid bone. Over on this side, we see the carpal bones. Those are nice and kind of square-like. We call them short bones. And up top here, we have the humerus. The humerus is a great example of a long bone. Okay, now let's take a look at some actual bones from the human body and try to identify their shape. So take a look at the bone on your left. What type of bone is that? If you said long bone, you're correct. This is a human humerus, and it is definitely a long bone. Now let's take a look at the bone right down here. What kind of bone is that? Well, if you said sesamoid, you're correct. This is the patella, otherwise known as the kneecap, and it's a great example of a sesamoid bone. Okay, what about up here? What kind of bone is that? Well, it's a vertebra, and a vertebra is a great example of an irregular bone. And then take a look at this bone right here. It's flat, it's like a spatula. Its name is scapula, and the scapula is a great example of a flat bone. And finally, right here, we have some short, square-like bones in the wrist, and darn it, I said it. These are short bones. Okay, now that we've learned a little bit about bone shapes, we're going to talk about the types of bone tissue. Now, we said last time on our tissues lecture that osseous tissue was a connective tissue, and that's true, but there's actually 2 different types of osseous tissue. There's compact bone and spongy bone. So compact bone is nice, smooth, and compact, and it makes up the majority of long bones. So on the outside of a long bone, you'll see this kind of hard, compact bone right there. That's all compact bone. And the functional unit of compact bone is something called an osteon. Osteons are these tree trunk-like structures we find in the bone, and in the middle of that tree trunk there's a Haversian canal where the blood vessels and the nerves are located, and then the bony rings are deposited on the outside. Okay, so we find compact bone on the outside of bones, and it's very strong and very, very smooth. The other type of bone we have is something called spongy bone. Spongy bone is never found on the surface, it's found internally. And the functional unit of spongy bone is something called trabeculae. Trabeculae means little beams, and so this is what spongy bone looks like. And spongy bone is important because it helps to give an internal framework to the bone, but it also is a site where we have red bone marrow, which is where our red and white blood cells are made. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a long bone. Again, examples of long bones would be your humerus, your femur, etc. So this is a long bone here. This is the human humerus. And we can see that the shaft is something called the diaphysis, whereas the ends are called the epiphyses. So diaphysis was a shaft, epiphysis were the end parts. Now the shaft is hollow, and then within that hollow shaft we often have something called yellow bone marrow, which is just fatty material. And then surrounding the diaphysis we have something called periosteum, which is a connective tissue layer that has osteoblasts in there, as well as blood vessels and nerves. And finally, up top, I want to point out something called the epiphyseal line. This is a line between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And this is an area where, in young people or adolescents, we actually have a cartilage growth plate that allows the bone to grow in length. Okay, now we're going to move on to talk about the axial and appendicular skeleton. So first, we're going to talk about the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton includes everything in a straight line, which includes your skull, your vertebra, and also your rib cage. In contrast, your appendicular skeleton is everything that is appended on to the vertebral column, and it includes things like your pectoral and pelvic girdles, along with your arms and legs. Okay, and starting out with the axial skeleton, we're going to look at bones of the skull. Now, we're not going to learn all of them. We're just going to learn some of the major ones. Now, bones of the skull are divided into two categories. We have our cranial bones, which enclose and protect the brain, and then we have our facial bones, which give us facial structure and allow us to speak. So first of all, let's take a look at the bones we can see right here. Okay, the bone up front here, the big bone, is called the frontal bone. Easy enough. It's the largest, strongest bone in the front of the cranium. Now, below that, we have some facial bones. The bone right here that makes up the top jaw is called the maxilla. Maxilla makes up the top jaw. Now, below that, we have the bone that makes up the bottom jaw, and that is called the mandible. And that's one of the strongest bones in the skull. Very, very, very strong. Now, to the sides there, these are the cheekbones, the green bones, and they're otherwise known as zygomatic bones. So next time you see somebody with nice cheekbones, say, hey, nice zygomatics. Now let's take a look at a lateral view of the skull. What we can see here was our frontal bone, which is right there. Okay, in back of that, we have a bone called the parietal bone. The parietal bone makes up the lateral aspect of the cranium. Below that is a bone called the temporal bone. Temporal bone is right here at your temples. It's a lot thinner and easier to break. Okay, below that, we already said we have our mandible, and then we have our zygomatic bone right there. And finally, up front, we have our maxilla, and then our nasal bone, which is the bridge of the nose. So now that you learned some of those bones, let's do a review. What bone is this here? Well, if you said parietal bone, you're correct. Again, the parietal bone makes up the majority of the lateral aspect of the skull. What about this bone here? It's in front. It's the frontal bone. Again, the frontal bone is the largest and kind of strongest bone that makes up the brain case. What about this bone here? Well, if you said maxilla, you're correct. The maxilla makes up the top part of the jaw, and the mandible makes up the bottom part of the jaw. What about these bones here? That's right, those are the zygomatics or cheekbones. Okay, now that we learned about the bones of the skull, we're going to go look at the other bones of the axial skeleton, and these include the vertebral column. So the vertebral column includes 5 different groups of bones. Now, up top in the neck, we have the cervical vertebrae. There are 7 of those in the neck, and they're very teeny tiny, and they allow a lot of movement. Below that are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and these are the vertebrae that articulate with the ribs. And below that are 5 very large and strong lumbar vertebrae, and these are the bones of the lower back. And below that, we have the sacrum and the coccygeal vertebrae. So I'm going to require you to know the numbers of vertebrae in the first 3 regions. This includes the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. Now, how do you memorize this? Well, I go by what time I eat the meals in the day. So first of all, I eat breakfast at 7 a.m., 7 cervical. I eat lunch at 12 or noon, so 12 thoracic. And finally, because I'm an old dude, I eat dinner at 5 lumbar vertebrae. So that's a good way to memorize the different number of vertebrae in the body. Okay, below the lumbar vertebrae are the sacrum and the coccygeal vertebrae. Now, the sacrum is a structure of fused vertebrae, and the purpose of the sacrum is to connect the axial skeleton, the spine, onto the hip bones, which is the ilium, ischium, and pubis. Now, below that, we have our coccygeal vertebrae. These are the tailbone vertebrae. They really don't serve any purpose at all, but if you've ever bruised or, God forbid, broken your tailbone, you know it's very, very painful. Okay, the other bones of the axial skeleton include the ribs and the costal cartilages here. So we have 12 different ribs, and we have 12 thoracic vertebrae. So that's how you can identify what's a thoracic vertebrae, is it's articulating with or touching a rib. Now, the first 7 ribs superiorly are going to be our true ribs. And we call them true ribs because they all connect directly with the sternum via their costal cartilages. Now, below that, we have something called false ribs. We have 3 false ribs, and these ribs are touching the cartilages of other cartilages, or cartilages of other ribs. And finally, our floating ribs don't have any cartilages at all and have no connection to the sternum. All right, now let's talk about the appendicular skeleton. We said the appendicular skeleton was everything that is appended to the axial skeleton, and it includes the pectoral and pelvic girdles. So the pectoral girdle here are the bones that connect the arm to the spine in some way. So those include the scapula and the clavicle. So the scapula is this big flat bone right here, and it looks like it has a great connection, right, with the ribs and stuff. Well, not really. In life, this bone is not touching the ribs at all. It's enclosed with muscle. So the only bony connection between the arm and the spine or the axial skeleton is this bone right here, and that's the clavicle. The clavicle or the collarbone runs right about here, and what it does is connect our scapula to our sternum. Okay, now on to the bones of the arm. The upper arm is made up of one single bone called the humerus, and the lower arm is made up of 2 bones called the radius and the ulna. Now, take a look at your own arm, and let's figure out which is the radius, which is the ulna. Find the pinky side, and the pinky side is going to be the one with the ulna. The thumb side is going to be the one with the radius. The way I memorize that is to remember, what do you say if something smells? You say PU, so pinky, ulna. The pinky is on the ulna side, the thumb is on the radius side. Now, you might be asking, why do we have 2 bones in the lower arm, but only 1 bone in the upper arm? The reason is it allows us to do this. We can do pronation or supination. Supination and pronation. So supination, I'm holding a bowl of soup. Pronation, I've got my hand downward like I'm dribbling like a professional basketball player. Okay, now let's take a look at the bones in the hand. Now, you're not in a human anatomy class, so we're not going to make you learn all the bones, but suffice it to say, we do need to learn the different regions of bones. So right here in the wrist, we have the carpal bones. A lot of carpal bones in there, okay? And they're very, very small bones. Anytime we have lots of small bones, that gives us a lot of flexibility right in our wrist. Above that, or distal to that, we can see that we have our metacarpals. Metacarpals are the bones of the palm right here. These are your metacarpals. And then distal to that, we have our phalanges. So each finger has 3 phalanges. We have a proximal, middle, and distal phalanx. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the bones of the pelvic girdle and the legs. Okay, first off, let's start with the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is made up primarily of the hips, and the hip bone itself is made up of 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So if you ever come home late at night and your mom or dad are mad at you and they've got their hands on their hips, they've got their hands right there on their hip bones, which are their ilium right there. So we have the ilium, ischium, and pubis. Again, ilium, ischium is what you're sitting on, and your pubis is located up here. So all 3 of these bones connect to this bone right here. This was the sacrum. The sacrum, again, was part of our axial skeleton. And so the purpose here is to connect our appendicular skeleton, our legs, onto our axial skeleton. That's the function of the hip bones. Okay, below the hip bones, or inferior to that, we have our first big leg bone. And the first big leg bone is the femur bone. The femur is a huge bone, very, very large, very impressive. And so we can see right here it has a diaphysis. We have the head of the femur. It's going to make up a ball and socket joint. We can see down here we have condyles, which are rounded areas that are going to articulate with the tibia or the shin bone. Up here we can see 2 structures. Okay, these are called trochanters. And anytime you see little spiny parts sticking off of a bone, oftentimes it's a site for muscle attachment. Okay, below the femur we have the tibia and fibula. These make up the lower leg. Okay, the tibia right here is the bigger bone, it's your shin bone, and the fibula is a small little insignificant bone. The way I tell them apart is what is a tiny lie? A tiny lie would be a fibula. So fibula means tiny lie. So the tiny bone is always the fibula. The big bone right there is the tibia. If you run your hand over your shin, you're feeling your tibia. Okay, the bones of the foot are similar to the bones in the hand, and I'm not going to hold you to know all the bones that are in the tarsus, for example, but I do want to point some things out. If you take a look at the skeleton in class and take a look at the number of bones in there, they're about the same as the number of bones in the wrist, but these bones are a lot bigger. And the reason is that the ankle is supporting a lot of weight of the body, the wrist is not. So the skeleton is always this trade-off between strength and flexibility. In areas like the ankle, we need strength and support. In areas like the wrist, we need more flexibility. Okay, once again, the ankle part was called the tarsal bones, and the palm of the foot are called the metatarsals, similar to the metacarpals. And just like the hand, the digits here are called the phalanges. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and talk about joints. A joint is anywhere where 2 bones meet together. So we have 3 different types of joints. The first type are fibrous joints. Fibrous joints are joined together by fibrous connective tissue, and they're usually immovable. Examples we'll talk about are in the skull. The other joints here we have are cartilage joints. Cartilage joints are where 2 bones meet together and are separated by cartilage. And these are usually slightly movable. An example here is our sternum and our ribs. We have cartilage right there. And finally, the last joints are the synovial joints. These are the true joints. When you think of the word joint, you think of elbows and wrists and things like that, joints that are freely movable. These are all synovial joints. And the synovial joints are enclosed by a synovial cavity. The bones in there have cartilage on them to reduce friction, and the synovial fluid is lubricating the whole joint apparatus and makes it very, very flexible. Okay, fibrous joints, again, our example was the sutures in between the individual skull bones. And these are usually immovable in adults. We can't move them back and forth. Now, I should point out that fetuses and newborns do not have fibrous connective tissue joining their individual skull bones together. And that's because their brains are growing very, very quickly, and we don't want those bones to fuse together until they're done growing. Now, what we do see in those areas, we see something called fontanelles, which are soft spots in there. And again, that allows the brain to grow very, very quickly. But as a result of having these bones not fused together, we do see that newborns sometimes have this egg-headed appearance because the skull bones are actually squeezed down as they pass through the birth canal. Okay, our next group of joints are called cartilaginous joints. Cartilaginous joints are slightly movable. An example here we already pointed out were the cartilages on the ribs. We have another area where there's cartilage in between the individual vertebrae. We have these fibrocartilage discs, and this gives us individually only a little bit of mobility, but because we have lots of vertebrae, overall the spine is fairly movable. Okay, now on to synovial joints. Synovial joints are the joints that we think of when we say joints. They include your elbows, they include your wrists, they include your shoulders, they include your knees, they include your hips. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples. Our first example here is something called a hinge joint, and a hinge joint is where we have bones that bend and allow movement in one direction. So the example we have here of a hinge joint is the knee. The knee is made up of the femur above and the tibia below. The fibula doesn't really play a role in here, but the knee allows uniaxial movement and allows flexion and extension. Now I can't demonstrate that with my knee here, but I will use my elbow because this is another example of a hinge joint. I can extend it, and that gives me a large angle of about 180 degrees, or I can flex it, and that gives me an angle of about 45. So flexion, extension, flexion, extension. That's all this joint can do. Okay, our next example of a synovial joint is something called a ball and socket joint, and our example of a ball and socket joint right here is the hip joint. So the hip joint is made up of the femur, which is right here. This is the head of the femur right here, and this is the hip bone itself. And the hip bone has a cavity called the acetabulum, which is right here. So head of the femur is inserted in the acetabulum. In this type of anatomy, the ball and socket joint allows for multi-axial movement. It allows it to move in several planes. Another example of a ball and socket joint is the shoulder joint. And the shoulder joint is also multi-axial. It allows for abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, hyperextension, and also circumduction. So it truly is a very movable joint. Okay, now we're going to shift gears again and talk briefly about the way that bones are formed. We said before that an adult has 206 bones in their body, give or take, but you might be surprised to know that a fetus actually has more. A fetus might have as many as 275 bones. And what this means is that as that fetus ages, at some point those bones are going to fuse together. So the major way that bones are formed, at least long bones, is through a process called endochondral ossification. Basically, we start out with a cartilage model, like you can see on your left-hand side. And so that cartilage model is deposited as cartilage, but at some point our osteoblasts move in, invade that cartilage, and start depositing bone. That bone becomes more and more, and then it becomes hollowed out by our osteoclasts, and then eventually we form a secondary ossification center up in the epiphysis. This secondary ossification continues, and we're eventually left with just this epiphyseal line right here. And if you remember, that epiphyseal line is actually the growth plate. It allows that bone to grow in length up until the time around adolescence, at which time that epiphyseal plate is eventually going to ossify over, and you're no longer going to be able to grow in height. Okay, here's another image of the epiphyseal line. Remember, the epiphyseal line was that line that allows for bone growth in length. And so what happens if we start here on this side, we can see that the epiphyseal line is depositing new cartilage on the top side, and on the bottom side, it is ossifying that cartilage into new bone tissue. So what it's basically doing is, as the bone's lengthening, it's stretching the epiphyses and making the shaft or diaphysis of that bone longer. But once that epiphyseal line becomes ossified, you can no longer grow in length. Okay, now we're going to talk about bone remodeling, and this is one of the first times we're going to talk about homeostasis and negative feedback loops. Remember, at the beginning of class, I said one of the functional characteristics of living organisms is ability to do homeostasis, and that's the ability to maintain a stable internal environment, even though things on the outside might be fluctuating. So here's one of those times where you have to memorize a negative feedback loop, and this loop covers calcium homeostasis. So who are the players here? We have three different cells: the osteoblasts, the osteocytes, and the osteoclasts. Now the word parts here, osteo means bone, that's probably familiar. Cyte means cell, so osteocyte means cell. Blast means a new cell or a young cell, and usually a cell that is actively secreting something. So osteoblasts are actually the guys that build bone, they deposit bone. So just remember that blasts build. Osteocytes don't really do much, they just are sort of the old curmudgeons out there that help to maintain the bone matrix. On the other hand, the osteoclasts break down bone. So the part clast means to break down. So osteoclasts break down bone. And you might be saying, why in the world would we have a cell that breaks down bone? That sounds very bad. Well, if you remember back, I said that bones were also sort of these banks for calcium for the body, that the body needs calcium for muscle contraction, for blood clotting, and if we don't have enough calcium in the blood at the time, we're going to go to our bones and make a withdrawal using our osteoclasts. All right, there's two different hormones which govern bone calcium homeostasis. One is called parathyroid hormone, and this stimulates our osteoclasts. And remember, osteoclasts break down bone. And so they break down the bone and they take that calcium and put it in the blood where it can be used for other things. On the other hand, calcitonin inhibits our osteoclasts, and calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland. All right, this diagram just illustrates the negative feedback loop that governs bone calcium homeostasis. So let's take a look at this scenario right here. Imagine a situation where the blood calcium is declining below some set point. Normally it's like this high, but it's going down for whatever reason. As a result, we're going to stimulate our parathyroid glands. They're monitoring blood calcium, and if it goes too low, they synthesize something called PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that PTH is going to stimulate our osteoclasts. Remember, the osteoclasts are the cells that degrade or eat bone, and when they eat that bone, they're going to deposit that excess calcium in the bloodstream, bringing calcium levels back up. Now, let's imagine the converse. Let's imagine that for some reason you've eaten a lot of calcium in your diet and we have way too much blood calcium. What are we going to do now? So now we're going to elevate our levels of calcitonin. Calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland, and as a result, that thyroid gland calcitonin is going to inhibit our osteoclasts, stimulate our osteoblasts, and that's going to cause deposition of calcium in the bones. Okay, now we're going to talk briefly about fracture repair. Chances are at least a few of you in this class have had a fracture or a break in a bone at some time. Now, the first thing that happens when you break a bone is you get a hematoma. Hematoma is just a lot of blood. Now, bones are very vascular and they have lots of nerves, so when you break a bone, it's painful and it also has a lot of swelling going on. Now, after a while, that hematoma is going to be basically formed into something called a cartilage callus, and this is a fibrocartilage callus. Even though this is a bone, initially the repair tissue is going to be fibrocartilage made by our fibroblasts. Eventually, that fibrocartilage callus will be ossified over by our osteoblasts, and then finally, our special osteoclasts will come in and basically degrade any spicules or stuff like that, and they'll do the bone remodeling. All right, before we wrap up this lecture, I'm going to talk briefly about osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a bone disorder, and it's caused when bone reabsorption outpaces bone deposition. Remember, reabsorption was the job of the osteoclasts, whereas bone deposition was the job of the osteoblasts. And so as this occurs year after year, the bones become lighter and more brittle and more prone to fracture. Now, there's several risk factors for osteoporosis. First is age. As you get older, you have greater risk for osteoporosis. The second one is being a woman. So women go through this change during menopause where their estrogen levels basically plummet very quickly. And as it turns out, estrogen and testosterone both have a sort of calming effect on our osteoclasts. Once we remove the estrogen or testosterone, poof, the osteoclasts go into overdrive and start eating lots of bone. Other risk factors for osteoporosis include insufficient weight-bearing exercise. Now, people that do a lot of running and jogging and stuff like that, they might have bad joints, but they have great bones because weight-bearing exercise really helps you to build bone in your prime years so you don't have osteoporosis later on. Another factor is a diet poor in calcium, right? You do need calcium. Another factor is a lack of vitamin D receptors. And finally, smoking is not good for osteoporosis either, so you don't want to do that. Okay, this slide just shows a sequence of radiographs from a woman in her 20s, 40s, 80s, and 90s. So let's take a look first in the women in her 20s. So again, this is a body of a vertebrae. You can see the inside there is made up of this spongy bone, and there's lots of lattices of those little trabeculae. Still looks good going into her 40s, looks fine. And then in her 80s, we can definitely see there's a lot of black area in here. So black is an area where we've lost ossification, where there's no longer bone there. And then finally into the 90s, wow. Look how much bone is missing. It's mainly just black in there, and so this bone is not very well supported. Since this is a vertebrae, it might just very well collapse on itself, but if this was a hip bone or something like that, she could very easily fracture it or something like that. So again, the risk factors for osteoporosis are age. Risk factors are lack of calcium in your diet, lack of exercise. You can't do very much about osteoporosis once you have it, but you can prevent it by getting calcium in your formidable years, doing lots of weight-bearing exercise, and avoiding smoking. Okay, so you've reached the end of the lecture on the skeletal system and joints. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email or a text. Talk to you soon.